every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. The topic of today is how do we end animal suffering? And to understand more about this topic, we have invited David Coman-Hidy, who is the president of the Humane League, which is a top-rated animal welfare organization. So I want to say, David, welcome to this interview.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, happy to be here.
David, if we could you help us understand how big is the problem about how animals are getting treated at the moment?
Yeah, it's unfortunately a pretty massive ethical, moral issue that we find ourselves in. I think most people probably have the general sense that animals in industrial agriculture aren't treated incredibly well, but most people aren't aware that virtually all farm animals are raised in enormous industrial facilities now, commonly called factory farms. They have essentially no legal protections that are very meaningful around the world. Standard, totally legal practices include things like forcing animals to live in cages barely larger than their bodies, mutilations without painkillers like having your tail cut off or testicles ripped off, euthanasia by breaking animals' necks or hitting their heads on concrete are all standard legal practices in most parts of the world. And not only is the degree of suffering quite high for each of these individuals, the number of individuals is just shockingly high. I mean, I work in the US, I focus a lot on US based issues much of the time. And that alone, we're talking about nearly 10 billion land animals each year, many of them chickens. When you add aquatic animals into the mix, I mean, the number just skyrockets into the tens, hundreds of billions. And when we think about global size of the problem of factory farming, you know, it's hard to get specific numbers, but again, we're talking about in the realm of tens or hundreds of billions of individuals suffering to a very high degree every day.
So if you want to do good in the world, if you have the mindset of effective altruism, we talked about this a little bit before the interview, then you could end much more suffering from helping animals than humans at the moment. It's still such a gap for that's what you're saying.
Yeah, one way that I think about it, if we take the mindset of effective altruism, I think one of the most salient kind of lenses to use here is not to, it's very difficult to compare the suffering of chickens, let's say, to perhaps humans living in extreme poverty or suffering from preventable diseases, because there's a lot of philosophical questions that come into play about how you weight the size of a brain and capacity to suffer and so forth. But you're definitely right in that the numbers are so large for animals that even if you greatly discount that capacity to suffer, that they're so numerous and the suffering is so great that we think it's a pretty safe bet to do a lot of good in the world and you can have really big impact. But more important perhaps than just the number of animals is the ability to do good on the margins. So the reality is there's lots and lots of people focused on ending human poverty, let's say, but there's very little going towards reducing animal suffering. There's not that many organizations. They aren't that well funded compared to human-based charities. So in addition to the scale of the problem being so large, there's just a huge capacity for growth to continue scaling up the good that is being done.
That's an important aspect you're adding. So it's not also about the size of the cause area. It's where can my contribution make the biggest impact due to how much diminishing returns would I get if I go into a certain
cause area. Yeah. Tell us if just one idea that I thought that animal welfare would have come further than what I'm hearing that you're saying, the regulations. So if I were to buy ecological eggs, is that completely non-effective for the chickens?
So eggs in particular are one of the areas where the most progress has been won, although it's still not very much, I imagine, compared to what most people think about progress. So you're in Sweden, I know, and Europe is actually on the cutting edge to some degree, as sad as that is, for animal welfare. And in particular, about 15 years ago now or so, the European Union banned what are called barren battery cages for egg-laying hens, and transitioned to either enriched cages. So these are still animals living in relatively small cages with, a small place to dust bathe and lay eggs and so forth. And many also switched to what are called cage-free farms, which are essentially large barn systems where animals are still indoors. And I think that is probably what's most typical in Sweden right now, would be this barn egg laying. There's actually an amazing animal charity in Sweden called Djurens Rätt that's worked quite a bit on this issue. That said, the vast majority of chickens in the world are raised in what are called battery cage systems. So these are about the size of a filing cabinet drawer, so quite small, where 5 to 7 birds are living for their entire lives. So we're talking 12 plus months gripping onto wire. Just imagine that, an entire year of your life with less space than a standard size iPad or a piece of paper to live in for an entire year, holding onto a cage. And that's the life for the vast majority of chickens. So while in some parts of Europe, in about 26% of the market in the United States, birds have been moved to large barn systems, they still face many of the cruelties of factory farming. So to answer your original question, it's not that it means nothing. I mean, it's very meaningful for a bird not to have to live in a tiny cage for their entire life. So that's why we work on this kind of progress, because it is meaningful. But I think it's probably quite far from what's in the customer's mind when they're buying ecological or organic eggs or something like this. And in fact, depending on the country, most of those regulations around, say, organic, are related to the feed that the animal is given, that they're given organic feed, rather than the welfare practices associated with the treatment of the animal or how they live their life.
So I guess empathy occurs when you put yourself into the perspective of the other person or animal here. So just understanding how the animals are actually still living. It's almost like hearing animals are being born, chickens are being born into being slaves, who are in Europe. Some part they might not have those cages where it would be brutally slaves. It would just be a slave, and then your sole purpose would be to is that to be killed in the end, or what's going to happen with in the good case? How does the good chicken's life look like if in the best case scenario?
Well, I would say, there's a very small percentage of the market that would be probably close to what most people would think of as like a very happy life for a farm animal, where they're mostly getting to live outdoors and they're protected from predators and they have the ability to essentially live their life in the way they'd want to, kind of walking around and enjoying themselves day to day. But this is a vanishingly small percentage of the market. And when it comes to buying food at a supermarket or going out to eat at a restaurant, there's a near 0% chance that that is where an egg would be coming from. And I think, again, we're getting into the realm of philosophy here of like what makes a life worth living, or what is a good life for a chicken. we have quite a bit of knowledge about what chickens don't like, what causes them suffering, what they will pay costs in studies to avoid having happen to them. And again, the reality is for virtually all chickens, the baseline is so incredibly low that we can make some tweaks on the margin, like getting them out of cages, and greatly reduce their suffering. So it's less about what is like the ideal. We're so far from what is the ideal. And the reality is like we need to reduce consumption. There's no way for the rate of animal product consumption to exist as it does today, where we're also providing these animals with a great life. And the reality is the profit motive is antithetical to providing a good life for animals. And it's like the direction we see year after year, this industry or these industries moving towards, is how do we make the animals as a widget in a machine more and more efficient? So how do we make the birds that we kill for meat, make their breast larger and larger and larger, and make them grow faster and faster and faster so we can cycle out the flocks more frequently? And that's resulted in animals who, just by the nature of what we're asking of their bodies, die at a very young age from complications. And even just being alive, even if a chicken, a broiler chicken is what they're called, who's raised and killed for meat, was allowed to live on Old McDonald's farm in a pasture, within a few weeks would literally be unable to walk around because their body would be so grossly oversized and their organs would be failing because of the growth that we've selectively bred them to go through. So I guess for me, when I think about these questions of like, what would an ideal situation look like? The much more salient political issue is like, how do we raise the floor and the standards for those birds who are caught in the system, or the pigs or the cows, and then also reduce consumption rather than going towards this ideal? And I don't say this out of like a deontological rights-based reasoning, but rather what seems like will actually be the most effective way to change the world for these animals.
Basically, we're that far off that it's just we need to step it up in the. Yeah.
I also just don't think that reasonably we can get, like, there isn't a political reality or even an ecological reality where we can consume what we consume at the same rate with this many tens of billions of animals and provide for them in a meaningful way.
Mm. I read on the website, the Humane League.org, right? Where you can follow a story of a chicken's life, which really is touching. And I read that one thing that they're doing towards the chickens would be to increase some kind of lightning when the chickens should sleep, so that instead of sleeping, they're going to continue eating so that they become bigger. And just that, it becomes so twisted to hear that that's the how the the business is doing business.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in addition to our campaign against the cages that I brought up before, the battery cages, one thing we've been fighting now for a few years is increasing the welfare or reducing the suffering of these broiler chickens who are raised killed for meat, who are the vast majority of the land animals that we're eating. And one of the changes that we're asking for is indeed addressing what you just brought up, that the birds are kind of kept in this constant zombie-like state of sleep deprivation by manipulating them. They're not ever given a solid period of time to sleep, so that they're just more, I mean, from a company's perspective, a broiler chicken, instead of being a living, feeling individual, and keep in mind, these are baby animals. They're slaughtered at about a month old. So these are essentially like a kitten or a puppy, right? It's like a baby chicken who's growing obese incredibly quickly. And they're a machine that processes chicken feed. You put the chicken feed into the machine, and then you get a chicken breast out of it, or legs or thighs for wings. So the only incentive for a company like Tyson is, how do we make the conversion rate more efficient by any means necessary, even if we have to keep them up all night, even if we have to breed them so large that many of them die from what's called flip-over syndrome, where their heart and lungs, their organs just give out because of the strain on their bodies. This is like an acceptable cost of doing business. You just need to optimize for the number who will die spontaneously because of the stress we put their body under. If the efficiencies gained by this overclocking of the metabolism is worth it, then that's fine. That's just the cost of doing business, and you clean up the dead birds each day. It's hard to think of a more avaricious and cruel industry than the broiler chicken industry, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that paints the picture. So then where does your organization, the Humane League, where do you guys fit into this puzzle? What is the work that you're doing?
Thanks for asking. So the Humane League is a global nonprofit. We work in a lot of places around the world, and our mission is to end the abuse of animals raised for food. So we tackle this really massive issue we've been talking about in a number of ways, but in particular, we fight for a lot of institutional change to, like I was talking about, kind of raise the floor of standard treatment for animals. We also recruit and train volunteers who power all of our campaigns and just help build a movement and build political power and strategic power in the countries we're operating in. And especially internationally, we give a lot of grants and hold training seminars and run coalition campaigns with organizations doing this kind of work around the world. We run something called the Open Wing Alliance that actually Dieren's Right in Sweden is a member of, as well as many European groups. And in the US, we've even been involved in a number of ballot initiatives, and these are ways that citizens can vote to pass a law in a state as well to ban things like battery cages, gestation crates for mother pigs, and that kind of thing.
Could you tell us more about the standards? Give us, what are the standards that you're trying to raise throughout the chicken production chain,
Yes. So